Hello, DPS community. Welcome to the EDUCA DPS podcast, where we inform families and connect communities. My name is Javier Ibarra, your host of the EDUCA podcast in English. Today, our guest is Wes Ogburn, Program Manager of School, Culture, and Bullying Prevention here at Denver Public Schools. Wes, I want to give you a warm welcome. You've been a guest that's kind of a repeat.
Yes.
Yes.
A wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much.
If we had maybe one of those punch cards that you could, like, at the third one, you get a free podcast or whatever.
Yes. Yeah, it would be all filled up.
And Wes, before we get into the questions that I have for you, I want to give our audience an opportunity to know a little bit about the background and the topic today. Today's conversation is about bullying prevention. And it is one that we should all have in collaboration between families, students, and educators. We should never have to wait for National Bullying Prevention Month, which is promoted in the month of October. Bullying happens more often than we can imagine, and that is why the topic is always relevant, regardless of the date we are on when listening to all of this information. So, Wes, I want to start off. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been with DPS?
Sure. My name is Wes Ogburn. I am a social worker by trade. My pronouns are he, him, his. My divas are Bjork and Dolly Parton.
Okay.
And I've been with DPS for 9 years, and I've been in and around educational settings for 18 years, so most of all of my career.
Right.
And I'm really passionate about this work because as a queer man myself, going to school was at times a bit challenging and sometimes kind of scary. I felt scared to share like my authentic voice and be my authentic self at times. Mm-hmm. And so for me, this work is very personal.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And I appreciate you telling us a little bit about your educational experience, because it lends to the fact that we truly brought on the expert here today to talk about this. And this is a topic that you and we've been doing for a few years now, I think. And so we continue to bring you along into the podcast setting because this information has updates quite a bit throughout the years.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us. And so I want to start off with, can you please share with us more about the work that you do specifically around bullying prevention?
Sure. So I work in the Department of Climate and Safety on a school culture, bullying prevention, and education grant. And our vision here at DPS is that all learners thrive. And when I think about and reflect on this vision, I imagine our schools being a place of such belonging that all of our students and our team members can bloom to the fullest and highest expressions of who we are. And so that's the tagline, belonging to blooming, which is a part of the work, and also why I wear a flower brooch and have and use flowers as a symbolic representation of what we're doing with this work. So we have a partnership with the Colorado Department of Education. We have a grant through them. Shout out to Adam Collins over at the state. He is our grant partner over there. And I'm happy to report that schools who have worked closely on this grant, especially our middle schools, have actually sustained lower numbers, lower student reports of bullying, and we're continuing that work further. We're broadening the work to expand more into our elementary schools at the moment.
Can you give us a quick number on what does it look like? Are we trending up? Are we trending down when it comes to bullying cases here at DPS?
Yeah, so in the high school or at the high school level, we're seeing lower numbers than we have before, but we're seeing a slight increase in our elementary schools. Our middle schools are staying somewhat the same, although many of them have lower rates than we have previously reported. But we're seeing a slight increase in our elementary schools.
And why do you think that is?
We actually don't know. We're still investigating the why. So the reasons behind an increase in bullying at that age is still a question that we're investigating to understand.
And I appreciate you mentioned that and that you answered that, because this bullying prevention is ever evolving, ever ongoing, right? The research, the reasons why. And so what might affect, for example, one particular generation might be different than what affects other generations. From my understanding is that the generation that we have now in our schools are, I would say, more understanding, more accepting, more around inclusion, right? Diversity and that sort of thing, than perhaps my generation or your generation, right? And so I think it's important to note that. But I want to also know the fact that we have lower bullying cases in our high schools. That's huge, right? I don't want to skate past that, because I want to make sure that our audience members hear that loud and clear, right? That we are making a difference when it comes to bullying prevention. In a second, we're going to talk about how the listeners can help us, right, continue this work about bullying prevention. Wes, I want to ask a little bit more about why is school culture in your title?
Yeah, so the bulk of the work is really on creating the conditions where bullying doesn't live. So we have a focus on what our values are, so who we want to be and how we want to show up with each other. We have a focus on our academic success and achievement. And when we focus on creating those conditions, conditions where our values are brought to life, where we embody and live them out and reward them, and when we focus on our academic success, we're less likely to have incidents of bullying. And so the culture piece is really the bulk and the focus of the work. And then when situations come up, we respond to them. But creating the cultures that we want to see is the primary focus of the work. And that's why the culture piece is in there first.
And so what is bullying exactly, and why is it important to differentiate it, right? Is everything between an altercation between two students considered bullying?
No, and it's important because the defining a situation as bullying or not helps us as a school team respond in a way that supports both the target and the offender in a meaningful way. So bullying is any intentional harm that's repeated over time, and that there's an imbalance of power that exists between the two parties. So this harm can be verbal, it can be written, it can be social in nature. And so a few different behaviors that are important to differentiate it with are like teasing. So in a situation where you have two parties who are having fun, joking around, and teasing each other, this isn't a bullying situation.
That's normal.
That's normal. It's a way for us to bond and connect. It's funny. And the important piece there is that both parties are having a good time.
So when does it switch?
So it might switch when one party is like, oh, this isn't fun for me anymore. I don't really like this type of teasing. This doesn't feel good to me. And then it could start bleeding into a bullying situation potentially. Another situation is conflict. So when we have a situation where there are two folks who have an equal balance of power and they have a disagreement, this is conflict. And they're able to solve the conflict with each other potentially, or at least come to some agreement. But there's no fear, or there's no one side has more power than the other. And that's a situation of conflict. The other behavior that we like to differentiate it from is like a rude or hot moment, which is a one-time event that is usually like a behavioral response to an intense emotion at the time. It's not repeated over time. It's an isolated incident, and where there's a balance of power between the two parties. So we've got teasing, which is important to differentiate when teasing might become a situation of bullying. Then we have conflict. There's a balance of power and a disagreement, and then like a rude or hot moment. So those three, there's a balance of power. And bullying, the biggest thing is that there's intent to harm, it's repeated over time, and there's an imbalance of power.
I'm glad that we're talking about this, because I think of when I was a DPS student, and I think about when I was younger, and part of the culture that I come from, which is the Hispanic culture, there's a lot of teasing going on.
Yeah.
Right? there's you get a nickname based on your physical attributes, right? I know a person named Gordo, even though he's not fat, but he was an 11-pound baby. And so that was considered a big baby,
right.
From what I understand, right?
Yeah.
And so, but it's not, more than anything, it's a term of endearment now, right? But from someone outside of the culture, they might say, wow, everyone keeps bullying, let's call him Juan or whatever. Everyone keeps calling Juan Gordo. His real name is Juan, but they keep calling him Gordo. Like, that's bullying. But based on what you just said, right, and assessing the situation, it keeps students from being labeled as aggressors, right? And I think at such a young age, if you're labeled an aggressor, then you might own that. You might look into that and say, wow, like, I guess I am. I had an opportunity to go back to my old elementary school for the work that we were doing, and I was telling the principal, I was like, oh yeah, like, I used to get in a lot of trouble because I was a bad kid, and she stopped me, which I thought was very interesting. I felt like I was in trouble, and she goes, you weren't a bad kid, you just did some bad things. And it changed my perspective even slightly, because it was more behavioral based than like, owning that sort of title, right? And so I'm glad that we talked about that, because culture does take effect into how students interact, right? Which can lead to arguments, but at the moment in time, if like you said, if they're not, there's no power dynamic, right? It's still fun for both parties. Then it's just how people bond.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's a powerful way to connect. And so the important piece there is that both parties are having a good time. It feels good to both. Both are laughing. It's enjoyable.
So then, Wes, why is it important to address this? Why is it important to address all of the bullying and the bullying prevention?
Yeah, it's so important because bullying, whether you experience it or even if you witness it, it destabilizes our sense of safety. And when we don't feel safe, it puts us into our like hijacked brain, where we're really focused on survival and being safe versus learning, versus art and sports and music. So bullying has an impact on all of us, whether you're the target of it, or even when you're watching or you experience someone else being bullied, it can impact your mental health and academic achievement.
Something that you just said there that really stood out to me is sometimes, depending if your needs aren't being met, you can, I don't want to say act out, but act out of character, right? When some folks, you've maybe talked with them and they're your friends, and for some reason that day they were a little mean to you, or they were acting out of character, right? It's important to see, okay, well, why was that, right? Never excusing the reason for bullying, right? But it's keeping us from labeling certain folks a bully. It's keeping us from doing that. Now, of course, the situation has to be addressed always, right? And here in Denver Public Schools, every single staff member is a mandatory reporter. So if you see something, you have to say something, right? And so we can rest assured to our audience that this is the case. But in the situation of the example here that we're talking about, is there has to be some sort of power dynamic. There has to be some sort of, this is no longer fun for me, right? And so I appreciate you saying that. Yeah,
and I think maybe what you're calling out too is like, we want to, as schools teams, to work with changing behavior. So especially young kids, it's a time where we can shift behavior. And I think asking why this is important, if left unchecked, situations of bullying turn into various serious situations. And I think of an extreme example would be a situation of domestic violence. And so it's a very serious potential that can happen if we don't really stay conscious of and work towards creating the culture we want to see, culture of healthy relationships, good friendships. That the extreme end of bullying is really dangerous for all of us.
And it's important to note, right, you can have conflict within a healthy relationship. You can have disagreements within a healthy relationship. It's, again, goes back to the power dynamic. So, Wes, my next question for you, and I think this is going to be one of the most interesting questions for our audience members to want that answer, which is, how might an election year impact bullying? Right now, at the time of this recording, we're in the middle of what we call, it's time to vote, that sort of thing. Most folks have received their ballot. And so with that, you're seeing a lot of advertisements around the election. So how does that affect bullying in our schools, or does it?
Yeah, so it has the potential. And some studies have shown that political bullying may increase during times of election. I think what's really important is for us to think about what is it that I believe? Why do I believe it? And then how do I have a disagreement with someone and stay focused on the topic without getting into a personal attacks, without getting into attacking the other person, but that I'm speaking from a place of, here's what I believe, this is what I think is important, and allowing or understanding how to disagree with someone in a way that doesn't target them, that doesn't isolate them, that doesn't create this polarization. And I think as adults, we're learning how to do that. It's something that I think we, as the adults in and around educational systems, have to take very serious.
Yes.
What do I believe, and how do I engage in a conversation that's meaningful? I mean, I think of my own life, having conversations with folks in my family. It's really important to have, for me, clear boundaries about what we'll talk about and how we'll talk about it, so that there's a peaceful way of discussing these really hot topics that can really activate folks.
Well, and I also want to ask, we have a lot of younger students in our school district, right? We have students that are 3 years old, and we have students that are all the way up to 18 years old. And then we even have students at the technical college. So really, we have a wide range of student ages, right? Do our younger students understand the election? Do they understand some of those things? Because I think a lot of parents might say no, therefore it's not important to talk to them about it.
Sure, yeah. I think you'd want to have discussions with your kids that are developmentally appropriate, but I would say the more important piece is how you're talking about these topics. So modeling disagreement without tearing someone down, without targeting someone. So whatever you decide to talk about, what we want to encourage is a discussion that's peaceful and that's meaningful, and that isn't antagonizing or tearing down another person.
So shifting gears here to another outside force, how does social media play into bullying?
Yeah, so we conceptualize social media as sort of a location of where bullying will happen. And so I like to talk about how social media is in fact a neutral tool. It gives us what we put into it. And so we've seen the best of who we are and the worst. And so one of the real important pieces about social media, I think, is for us to have a good relationship with social media, meaning I'm conscious about what it is I want to experience. I'm conscious about how I'm interacting with it. I'm conscious with, I guess, how I'm like using it.
Yeah.
So for myself, I want social media to be a good time. I want to see beauty, art, something funny.
Sure.
So I'm ensuring my feed reflects that, and I am ignoring, blocking stuff that isn't serving kind of like Wes's personal good.
Sure.
So my social media feed's real clean, and it's real intentional. So I would say, my advice would be for all of us as adults to think about, what do I want to experience in social media or on social media? So start by modeling, and then really shaping the social media experience to reflect that.
Something that you said that really stood out to me was you get out what you put in. And I have a specific example of that, and I feel a little bit, I don't want to say guilty, maybe ashamed of it, because I would interact with some of the, I would say, trolls of the world. and I would go back and forth with them.
Yes.
What I realized I did to my mental health was it really drained me.
Yes.
It drained me so much. And here's the thing is because when it's impersonal and you don't know the person behind the keyboard or behind the screen, people say anything.
Anything.
And here I was thinking, and I was a lot younger then, but here I was thinking, well, if I apply a little logic,
okay,
I'll be able to win them over. Right?
Yeah.
And then it wasn't as fun for me as I thought it would be. There was no, I don't know, success rate, right? Because you can't win with the trolls of the world. And so I think it's important, like you said, just kind of ignore that. And so the moment I decided to stop engaging with the trolls, specifically on some of these social media platforms, my mental health increased tenfold.
Yeah.
But also I started seeing the world as more of a positive place, right? And so I thought, wow, that just a small shift in behavior or action changed my outlook on it. So I wanted to point that out for our listeners.
Yeah.
My next question for you is, and it's very important, what can schools do about bullying? I'm sure we have a lot of principals, school administrators, superintendents listening to this podcast. What can schools do about bullying?
Yeah, so schools are already taking a lot of action to prevent bullying, and that would be the focus area. So building out and having your plans for school culture, also with your instructional, having them aligned. And so practices such as social emotional learning, there's a practice called positive behavioral intervention support, which is where we identify the behaviors we want to see, where we're rewarding them, supporting them, teaching them.
Yes.
Our prevention practices like restorative practices, trauma-informed, these are all ways that a school can engage in preventative measures, which is where we want the bulk of the work to be. And then having the process for intervening when a situation comes up. So working with reports of bullying, investigating, collecting the information so we can make a determination, and then moving forward to support the target with any necessary mental health supports, and then also working with the offender so that we can change the behavior, which would include potentially mental health supports and a disciplinary process that's fair.
Wes, I want to make a very bold statement. You can tell me if this is okay to say or not, but is it okay to say that here at Denver Public Schools, regardless of the school you attend, we take bullying very seriously?
Yeah, there hasn't been a single school team that I've met with and spoke with, worked with, that doesn't have this belief that bullying is very serious, that the measures to prevent and intervene are taken very serious. Yes. Yeah.
When I think about all of the important things that happen in the school building every single day, right? Because ideally the goal is to achieve as much academically as it is socially, right? To understand and interact with the world, right? But when I think about all of the competing goals, as a community member, as a parent, I would think, well, what are we doing about bullying, right? And so this is why we're having this conversation with you, our expert, is to show the families like we have plans, we have implementations, we have strategy, we have best practices, and it's all being implemented now. This conversation, more or less, is to give people the awareness of it, right? Because it's bullying prevention, right? Awareness month, but also where to access these resources, right? And so my next question for you is, what can family members do? We talked about what schools can do. What can families do to help bullying prevention?
Yeah, so our families ideally are the first place that we can feel a sense of safety, a sense of authenticity, where we feel free to be the full expressions of who we are. We have some structure where our family can support us with that. And so my first, I guess, offering would be that as a parent, making sure that my home is a safe place, that I'm creating the culture in my home that is supportive of my child. So starting there. So like
That's step one.
Yeah, making a safe place for my own child. A couple focused areas that a parent can think about is how do I build a healthy sense of self or healthy self-esteem? So the ways to promote a healthy self-esteem. Another great topic of conversation is promoting healthy relationships. So with all these, it's also getting clear on how am I as the adult, having a healthy sense of self-esteem, a healthy, how am I engaging and clear with healthy relationships. So those are two great topics. Another topic that can be powerful to talk about in the home is the concept of upstanding. And so this is where you are witnessing a situation that's happening and you stand up. You're witnessing a situation maybe of bullying, and so learning the skill to stand up and intervene.
Right.
And then the other helpful practice is to think about and to discuss a healthy relationship with social media,
which we just talked about.
Yes, and parents can also work with their school teams. If a situation comes up. So reaching out to your teachers, your school administrators, the counselors, mental health workers is something else that parents can do.
Wes, what are some signs that my child might be being bullied in school?
Yeah, so a student withdrawing, saying that they don't want to go to school, changes in their mood. Those are some changes in diet. Those are some of our first tell signs. And so as a parent, staying a bit curious and observing if any of those changes are happening. And so any changes in activities, desire to go to school, those might be a clue that something's going on.
And then what can you do about it?
So then it's creating a space where you can have a good open conversation. And sometimes as a kid, it's real scary to talk and share about something like this that's happening. So there's also an element of watching and noticing, what's my students' baseline, how are they normally behaving, and then noticing when things shift, and then having an open conversation about what's going on, and then working with the school team as well.
How do you get to that point though, right? Because often we ask our children, how was school today?
Yeah.
And it's a question that there's a lot behind it, right? Because as a parent, you say, how was school today? And you probably want to know, tell me about your favorite part. Tell me about, were you bullied, right? Was there anything that happened? Anything like that, right? But for the child, they might interpret that and say, wow, that's a big question to unpack. Well, school might have been just fine. So the automatic answer is fine.
Yes.
School was fine.
Yeah.
Right?
So having different ways to talk about the day. So tell me how your day. Maybe tell me about your favorite part of the day. Or sometimes it's also listening. So having a direct conversation also for a child is I don't know, it's fine. I did great. But also listening and maybe observing what they're into or interested in is a way that a parent can demonstrate that they're watching and that they are seeing, versus having the direct conversation. So you may notice so and so came up in conversation, and I noticed that you have a good time with them. So sometimes it's just naming as a parent what you're seeing, and it's not necessarily asking. But maybe also naming, I've noticed there's been a change. Is there anything that we could talk about?
I just had $1 million idea.
Yeah.
A book that is nothing but questions, and you title it Questions to Ask Your Child.
Okay.
And then subsections are questions to ask your child about, to get more out of how school went. Are they being bullied, right?
Yeah.
Are they going through something, right? We talked about suicide prevention, and that's another situation. Is that a book that exists? Because if not, I'm sure we're going to get DPS to help out and do this, because this is the important work.
Yeah. And how do we just connect with our kids, right? Because, I remember being a kid, I didn't want to tell my mom and dad about things that were happening at school. And so sometimes it was, having other adults in my life too that I could connect with. But yeah, the book would be questions, but also like just how do I show up in my home?
Right.
So I'm creating an atmosphere of sharing.
A bullying prevention book.
Yeah.
We need it. We need it
Yeah.
now. Wes, my next question for you, kind of the opposite of the first one, is, which was how I can tell if my student is being bullied. Now let's flip the script. How can I tell if my student is bullying?
Yeah, so this is real important and helpful. So, having values and standards in your home is one place to start. But you might notice if your kid is acting aggressively towards other students, or if they're openly racist or homophobic or transphobic, getting in trouble at school. These are all indicators that they might be bullying. And so therein again is creating the conditions and the atmosphere that you can have a good conversation with your kid, or you can move in the direction to change the behavior. And in some families, it's just, you better knock it off.
Right.
It's a very clear, stop doing that.
Quit it. Yeah.
Yeah, knock it off.
Right.
So having like direct conversations about this isn't who we are as a family and this is not how we behave. And then if it's persistent, you work with the school mental health team, with the school team. We have folks who are passionate and skilled at doing this type of work that can help.
Wes, I want to ask, before we get into our last question here, is around, you mentioned some of the things that we can do to see if they're being bullied, some of the things that we can do to see if they are doing the bullying, right? And I want to say it like that because I don't want to label students as bullies.
Sure.
Right? I say, are they engaging in the behavior of bullying?
Yeah.
Right? Because that really changed my perspective, right?
Yep.
So I don't want to label someone and then they own that, and then once they own it, that's become part of the identity. We can't go back from that, right? I mean, we could, but we'd have to unpack it.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of time and effort, right? If we just learn to address behaviors. But what are some of the things, maybe some resources that you can share with us about what we can do for bullying prevention?
Yeah, so any of our school teams can be great resources. So reaching out to folks who are working in your school to help support with any bullying situations. And also our family constituency services is another great resource for our parents who maybe have reached out to our schools and would like some further support. Another resource for parents is commonsensemedia.org, which is a great website for navigating social media, movies, and film. And then we also have Safe to Tell, which is one of our anonymous reporting systems that if you have a situation, you report it, it goes to dispatch and to school teams to respond.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of these resources. Is there a final message that you might have for us? Something that you said, oh, Javier didn't ask me this, but I sure want to mention it. Is there anything that you want to say?
I think going back to the topics or the concepts of like how we want to have healthy relationships with ourselves, healthy relationships with others, learning how to engage in upstanding behavior and a healthy relationship to social media. I think when we start there and we really work on imagining what we want to, the relationship we want to have with ourselves that's loving and nurturing, maybe a little humble, the relationship we want to have with others, we start getting a nice guide for ourselves of how we want to be with ourselves and how we want to be in relationship with others. I think when we start there, there's just a less likelihood that we will accept bullying behavior towards ourselves or towards others.
Wes, I want to thank you for joining us time and time again to talk about bullying prevention and coming on to the show. So thank you so much for coming by.
Yes, thank you.
Well, friends and families, this concludes our EDUCA DPS podcast for today. A big thank you to our guest, Wes Ogburn, for sharing this important information. And I'd like to ask all of you to please help share this content, which is the best way to support this show, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Denver Public Schools Plus, where you can find great EDUCA content, and all of our multimedia productions, which includes podcasts, videos, and stories. You can also find us on all the major podcast platforms. Just search for the Denver Public Schools Podcast Network. Here at EDUCA, we want to express our gratitude to the entire communications department and a big thank you to our proud superintendent of Denver Public Schools, Dr. Alex Marrero, for his continued support to the EDUCA DPS podcast and all of our multimedia productions. Don't forget to tune in to our EDUCA DPS podcast, where the learning journey continues. And please remember to tell your children more often, I believe in you and I know you can do it. I'm Javier Ibarra. Until next time.